To all the people that have showed up at the rally for our brothers and sisters at Local 1944. It was a great event, and I know that you sent a very powerful message on behalf of the bargaining committee. So, brothers and sisters, it's been a long time since we've welcomed our next guest to the National Policy Conference. He has been and done many things today, and today is the co-founder and co-director of AIDS Free World, an international advocacy organization that exposes injustice, abuse, and inequality, the social ills that underpin the ongoing existence of HIV. Stephen Lewis is a champion of the Order of Canada, the highest award for lifetime achievement. He's a professor of distinction at Ryerson University in Toronto, and a professor of practice in global governance at the Institute for the Study of International Development at McGill University. Stephen Lewis worked with the United Nations spanned more than 2 decades, and including being the UN's General Secretary, Special Envoy of the HIV/AIDS in Africa, the Deputy Executive Director of UNICEF, and from 1984 to 1988, he was Canada's ambassador to the United Nations. And in 2005, Stephen was named by Time magazine as one of 100 most influential people in the world. We can also never forget that Stephen Lewis was also the leader of the Ontario NDP and for a time was the leader of the official opposition. He is also the author of the best-selling book, Race Against Time. Please welcome this distinguished, committed social democrat, unparalleled Canadian and internationalist, Stephen Lewis.
Thank you, everyone. That was a hugely extravagant introduction, which I deeply appreciate. And what I want you all to know is that I'm not just a socialist to the core of my being, but I'm also an advocate and supporter of the trade union movement to the core of my being. So I'm tremendously tickled to be here today and to be given the opportunity to speak. I was remembering during the introduction from Ken that my dad, who was the federal leader of the New Democratic Party, prior to that was a labor lawyer, spending a very considerable part of his life working intimately with the steelworkers on grievances and benefits and contracts and the whole realm of activities which embrace the labor movement. So there's a kind of genetic quality here. I'm deeply immersed in the history, and I'm delighted to be a part of it. And both Ken and Leo have been tremendously good friends and supporters of some of the activities I've been privileged to engage in, and that's part of what I want to address you about today. But before I do, I want to remember somewhat nostalgically, and Leo reminded me just a couple of moments ago, that we are 31 years since the Humanity Fund for the Steelworkers. I want you to know the first of the social justice funds amongst the entire trade union movement in Canada. The Humanity Fund was created at the end of 1985, in response to the Ethiopian famine. And I can remember being at the conference or convention when the Humanity Fund was voted on and put into place by the steelworkers. And I want to say to all of you that you have made the most memorable, extraordinary contribution to the struggle for international social and economic justice. The steelworkers in Canada, and indeed in the United States, have been tremendously supportive in financial, intellectual, and human terms of the work that the NGO, the non-governmental organization AIDS-Free World, has been able to do. And I thought I would use this opportunity, because I think it may be of interest to delegates, to tell you what your money, your dollars, your commitment, your principles have supported over the last few years. I spent 5 or 6 years of my life between 2001 and 2006 as the envoy on HIV/AIDS in Africa. In other words, I spent 5 years of my life watching people die. And it was an wrenching and emotional experience, something I will never forget. And I've spent the last many years still dealing with HIV and AIDS. It's not a communicable disease which is over by any means. There are 36 million people in this world living with the virus. Only 15 or 16 million of them are in treatment, which means that another 20 million are still fighting for survival, the greatest concentration being on the continent of Africa. And when I left the work of the envoy in 2006, one of my colleagues, a woman who lives in Boston, and I decided together to create something called AIDS-Free World and turn it into a vigorous advocacy organization to deal with the underlying problems that generate the virus, that are responsible for giving the possibility of AIDS infections to vest and then spread. And as we looked at the areas which make women in particular vulnerable, poverty and disease, we discovered, and perhaps it was obvious, that there's another reality that prompts the spread of the virus, and that is sexual violence. Because the more horrific and grotesque the sexual violence is, the more the possibilities of transmission take place. And as we studied the parameters of sexual violence and tried to think collectively with a few colleagues where we would zero in, we suddenly discovered, and it was extremely disconcerting, profoundly distressing, that one of the places that sexual violence was occurring and was causing the transmission of the AIDS virus was amongst United Nations peacekeepers working in peacekeeping operations in a number of countries in the world. And we couldn't get over it. How can you have a phenomenon where you send peacekeepers into a country and they prey sexually on the civilian population? So we decided to take this issue on, and we took it on in significant measure with the support of the Steelworkers, because I had the opportunity to speak to the executive board in Pittsburgh and to the executive board when it was meeting in Toronto of both the twin sides of the steelworker equation. We held a workshop in 2014 here in Montreal, because I was teaching at McGill at the time. And we sat down and we looked at every single aspect of peacekeeper involvement in these conflict countries in an effort to see what could we do in legal and advocacy terms to eliminate the sense of immunity that peacekeepers have. Because whenever they were accused, whenever there were any allegations of sexual violence, the UN calls it sexual exploitation and abuse. Whenever they were accused of any allegations, they hid behind the screen of immunity, which the United Nations possesses under something called the Convention on Privileges and Immunities, which dates back to 1946 and was never intended to apply to peacekeeping operations because they weren't in place in 1946, nor was it intended to apply to sexual violence because no one cared about sexual violence several decades ago. So we sat in our workshop and we worked everything through, and then we decided we would launch what we called our Code Blue campaign to end immunity for sexual violence by peacekeepers and to confront the intolerable situation directly. And then something extraordinary happened. Because word had spread that we were engaged in these issues, we began to receive leaked documents. And one of the documents took your breath away. It was a report which had been compiled by two interviewers. One of them was a woman from UNICEF, and the other was a woman from the United Nations High Commission on Human Rights who had interviewed little boys between the ages of 8 and 10 in the Central African Republic in a peacekeeping operation. And the little boys had been forced to perform fellatio on a number of French peacekeepers, and then they were sodomized. They were raped by the peacekeepers. And it was such a stunning revelation, we didn't frankly know how to handle it. It was absolutely unassailable in its content. There was no question. It was irrefutable of what had happened. We decided that the only way to handle this was to go public. We couldn't understand why it hadn't been made public. The events had occurred in May and June of 2014, and we discovered their existence in early 2015, and we didn't understand how the lid had been kept on such sordid realities with children at risk. So we went to the Guardian newspaper in the United Kingdom, which is the equivalent of the New York Times, and we leaked it to the Guardian on April 29th, 2015. And all hell broke loose, particularly in Europe, and of course, particularly in France. And suddenly the world was seized with this horrific phenomenon of peacekeepers preying on little boys, in return for which the little boys got scraps of food. These were orphan children living in an internally displaced camp by the airport in Bangui, the capital of the Central African Republic. And in return for sexual acts, they were given a few scraps of food. That was the measure of their desperation. We released it on April 29th. On May 13th, we held a press conference in New York to launch our Code Blue campaign. And the press conference was anchored at one end by the Canadian General Romeo Dallaire, who, as you know, was the force commander in Rwanda during the genocide. And it was anchored at the other end by Graça Machel, who is the widow of Nelson Mandela and a remarkably formidable person in her own right. And there were 2 or 3 other people on the panel, headed by my co-director, Paula Donovan, who has carried this issue forward. And again, there was a lot of attention paid. And because we held the press conference and said we cared about this issue, suddenly we began receiving the most disturbing. There was a conspiracy of silence. There was a cover-up at the most senior levels of the United Nations. It was extraordinary. You would never think that people who are in exalted positions in the great multilateral organization of this world would be willing to suppress information in order to maintain their own reputations. But that's exactly what had happened. And on May the 29th of 2015, 1 month after we had released the stories about the little boys, we released emails and statements showing the existence of the cover-up. And then something extraordinary happened within the United Nations. Normally, no one ever takes exception with the Secretary General of the UN, Ban Ki-moon. None of the governments tend to challenge the Secretariat. They always do what the Secretariat has asked. In this instance, the governments got mad. They were really concerned what the devil was going on, that there were cover-ups of sexual abuse when the Secretary General pretended to a policy of zero tolerance. So they demanded an inquiry. And the Secretary General resisted. And 15 countries got together, of which Canada was one, and said either you conduct an external review of what's going on in peacekeeping operations. Incidentally, the most expensive operation that the United Nations undertake. It costs $8 billion a year, and its reputation is being compromised by these episodes of sexual exploitation and abuse. So the government said to Ban Ki-moon, if you don't launch an inquiry, we're going to pass a resolution and force your hand. So he capitulated, and he said he would launch an inquiry. And later in June of 2015, he appointed Judge Marie Deschamps, a Canadian judge, a former Supreme Court judge in Canada, to conduct a review in conjunction with 2 others of what had gone wrong, and a systemic review not only of the Central African Republic, but of what was happening in peacekeeping operations around the world. And she engaged in the review, And in the course of the review, of course, she realized that for 9 or 10 months, this cone of silence had been placed above the realities of what had happened to those kids. And on December 17th, she published her report. It was the most damning report that I have read out of the United Nations system, and I've been involved in that system for nearly 30 years. She called it a gross institutional failure. She cited 3 people for an abuse of authority. She cited another half dozen people who had made egregious and indefensible errors in the way in which they handled the situation. And who was she talking about? The executive director of UNICEF, the children's agency, the executive director of the High Commission on Human Rights, the chief of cabinet to Ban Ki-moon, the head of the Ethics Commission. One after another, she named people at the highest echelons who had been delinquent in their activities around what had happened to these children and around all of the regulatory procedures which should have made a difference. The report was a bit of a bombshell within the UN, and we read it very carefully and came to the conclusion that the UN was so broken when it came to sexual exploitation and abuse that they were willing to tolerate the intolerable, that we proposed that there be a kind of receivership occur, that around sexual violence the UN be put into receivership where peacekeepers were concerned, and we would appoint an external panel by the member states, and it would watch everything that went on for a 2 or 3 year period, correcting things in real time, and it would turn it back to the UN after the 2 or 3 years were over and the reforms had taken place. Now, I've played a role as a co-director. It's been my co-director, Paula Donovan. We're both going to go at one point to appear before the executive board in the United States later in the year. I want them to hear from Paula directly, but it gives me pleasure to be able to say, and it's not egocentric, I promise you, that we've been able to move this agenda forward. The United Nations is responding to the first time to a horrible predicament, and then what happened? January comes, and February comes, and more instances of gross sexual violence are appearing in the media. And individual NGOs in the Central African Republic, and as recently as last week in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, are identifying circumstances where there are acts of sexual violence perpetrated by peacekeepers. Ultimately, Ban Ki-moon had to fire the special representative of the Secretary General, a general himself. His name was Babakou Gaya from Senegal. He had to fire him from his role as oversight in the Central African Republic because the violence continued. And all of the ambassadors were gathered together into the General Assembly Hall to hear from the Secretary General how he was going to institute reforms. And President Obama came to the UN and held a summit on peacekeeping. And in the course of his opening remarks, he talked deeply about sexual violence. And for the first time in the history of the Security Council, just 2 weeks ago, there was a resolution on peacekeeper sexual violence because of what was happening. And all of that, I say, was driven by this little group of activists, supported in significant measure by Steel, to change the entire environment around the way in which women and children were treated. But it never ends. And then last week, I'm glad I'm speaking today, last week, we released a new set of findings which had come to us from within the UN, and you can't imagine the stir it has caused. We put out a statement indicating that UNICEF had interviewed 98 girls who alleged that they had been raped by peacekeepers. From what countries? From Morocco, from Burundi, from Tanzania, from Egypt, and from, trying to remember the last country, it will come to me. But they were all named, 98 young girls. and then the item which has riveted and stunned the international community. 4 of the girls said that they were tied up, they were stripped naked, and they were made to have sex with a dog in the presence of the commander. And that level of bestiality took everyone's breath away. And when the representative, the spokesperson of the Secretary General, held his noon briefing, as they do every noon at the United Nations, I guess as recently as last Monday, they conceded. In fact, they used the number 110 girls were being interviewed over the allegations of sexual violence. And they were, of course, looking at what had happened with the French soldiers. But this is the thing that drives you crazy. The French government, whose soldiers had sodomized those little boys, they got the information in July of 2014. And the president of France, breaks my heart to say this, a democratic socialist, the president of France said if they could identify the soldiers, the full force of the law would come down on those soldiers. And I want to tell you, the kids identified the soldiers with acute precision. They talked about the scars the soldiers who had raped them had. They talked about the tattoos on the soldiers who had forced them to perform fellatio. They talked about the earrings that soldiers were wearing. They identified the soldiers with extraordinary accuracy. That was back in June and July of 2014. To this day, not a single soldier has been charged or indicted or punished by the French judiciary. Not one. And their indifference, their willingness to scorn these realities is something that's profoundly shocking to those in the world of international human rights. So this question of peacekeeper violence is appearing day after day. When we issued this most recent material, there were 360 media hits, print, radio, and television around the world, and increasing demands editorially that the United Nations gets its act together. And that's what AIDS-Free World has been doing. And that's what our Code Blue campaign, if any of you like to Google things, you can Google codebluecampaign.org and see exactly the kinds of initiatives we're taking. And I really feel it's tremendously important because this struggle for gender equality, this struggle to overcome the depreciation and insufferable violence against women, it's not just in conflict areas, it's intimate partner violence, it's marital rape, it's gang rape, it's the kind of epidemic quality of the violence against women that has to be overcome. And to be sure, the element around peacekeepers is one fractional dimension, but it has attracted the interest of the world and the attention of the world. And by God, as I stand here before you, one day we're going to end it forever. It will never happen in another peacekeeping operation. It's okay. Do I have time for one more story? Let me tell you one other aspect which gives me tremendous joy that we've been engaged in, and again supported by the Steelworkers in Canada and in the United States. Back in 2008, a little group from Zimbabwe called the Girl Child Network came to us and said, we're right in the midst of election campaigns in Zimbabwe, and President Mugabe, who is a certifiable lunatic, not just a fascist, but a lunatic, President Mugabe has unleashed his Youth Corps and his war veterans to rape women systematically solely because they support the opposition party. And then they described a pattern of rapes which were blood-chilling. And we talked about it internally and decided, instead of gathering anecdotal evidence, which non-governmental organizations so often do, we would get actual affidavits and attempt to construct a case. So we secreted 100 women out of Zimbabwe. It was a very carefully designed, almost conspiratorial operation because we were so worried about their security. We managed to get all of them out of Zimbabwe into the adjacent countries of Botswana and South Africa. And then using pro bono lawyers from Canada and the United States and some from Africa, we took affidavits from the women. The evidence they gave would destroy the emotional psyche of anyone because the rapes were so violent and so ghastly and so political. I mean, there was a pattern that occurred whenever the women were being raped. The rapists would yell at them, "Tell this to George Bush. Tell this to Tony Blair. Tell this to the Westerners who are oppressing Zimbabwe." I mean, it was completely nuts. It was the kind of stuff that President Mugabe disgorges in his delirium of insanity. And yet, it took hold, and the women were raped in the presence of their families. Sometimes their children were present. Sometimes their partners were killed at the time of the raping. It was one of the ugliest episodes in a country which has had many ugly episodes. So we took all the testimony and we put it together. And because it had occurred during election campaigns, we put it in a report which we titled "Electing to Rape: Sexual Violence in Mugabe's Zimbabwe." And we constructed what we felt was an unassailable case of crimes against humanity. And we released the report at a press conference in Johannesburg in December of 2009. We couldn't do anything about it in Zimbabwe itself because the judicial system is completely corrupt and virtually non-existent. And Zimbabwe has never ratified the International Criminal Court statute. So we thought, we'll go to South Africa because South Africa has what is called universal jurisdiction. So Canada has universal jurisdiction. That's when a country ratifies the International Criminal Court statute, it's called the Rome Statute, and makes it a part of domestic law. And then you can use the Rome Statute to indict people from other countries when they pass through. And our argument was that there's so much traffic between Zimbabwe and South Africa for conferences, for vacations, for shopping, constant traffic, that undoubtedly the rapists would at some point come to South Africa, and if we could identify them, we could arrest them and put them to trial in South Africa. And the women constantly said to us, "We're destroyed, but we want justice." And we were determined to give them justice. So we kept at it, but we ran into an iron wall. The South African Police Service wouldn't investigate. The National Prosecuting Authority wouldn't initiate an investigation. We went to court. We won at court against the South African Police Service. They didn't care. They had the backing of President Zuma, himself a corrupt president of South Africa, who is in league with President Mugabe. Mugabe's already 92 years of age. I don't know what the hell's wrong with this world that he isn't dead yet, and one hopes he'll never get to 93. But we couldn't penetrate this unholy alliance between these two presidents. We went to the media. We became amicus, as it were, support in another court case which was being taken by the Southern African Litigation Center against Zimbabwe based on torture rather than rape, and they won, so we won. We hired a human rights legal firm in South Africa to keep the pressure on the South African Police Service and the National Prosecuting Authority. We hired a lawyer to look at all the evidence to make sure that we had the case that we said we had. Everything was in place, and between 2009 and 2016, we haven't been able to break through, and everybody says, "Why the hell don't you give up?" And our feeling is, if we get one of those bastards behind bars so that the women feel there is the possibility of justice in the world, it would be extraordinary. And then this timing is really amazing. 10 days ago, I feel very emotional about it, we get a letter from our legal firm in South Africa saying they had, under our instruction, taken one last shot at it, and they gathered together with 6 senior officials from the South African Police Service, and suddenly, and I have no idea why, except you learn in life never to give up, suddenly the dam broke. And the South African Police Service said, okay, we're ready to investigate. We will launch the investigation. You tell the women to get passports. Those who want to give testimony should be brought out of the country. We will put them in witness protection. Those were their words. We will pay for any wages or income they may lose. You get as many of them who are still willing to be a part of this to come to South Africa. We'll start the investigation process and we'll see if we can construct a case. It took our breath away. We were absolutely stunned, and you cannot imagine how exhilarated we feel, because there's never been anything quite like this. It looks as though South Africa will use universal jurisdiction to go after the rapist perpetrators out of Zimbabwe, and by God, that will create ripples right across the African continent. I have no guarantees that what looks so auspicious at the moment will actually happen, but we feel cautiously optimistic about it. And again, I want to emphasize that we couldn't have done it. We couldn't have summoned the time and the travel and the energy and all of the materials that have to be brought together if we didn't have the support of the steelworkers. Your international development discussion follows closely, I gather, after I'm finished, as I must finish. And I just want to say to you that the Humanity Fund you have does such extraordinary things around the world. It should give you incandescent pride. And I was fascinated to learn that you're going to hear from and discuss issues around Bangladesh, and particularly that horrific episode of Rana Plaza and what it means in the aftermath, and what the steelworkers are now doing. Because these kernels of support for struggling groups internationally who have nowhere to turn, who have no other sympathetic solidarity colleagues to lean on, you can't imagine what it means to them. It's everything. As the big donor governments pull back and stop funding the activities of groups, community-based, grassroots, on the ground, they are deeply wounded. And almost single-handedly, in a fashion that is so admirable, I cannot find words to express it, the Steelworkers of Canada and the Steelworkers of the United States are bringing social justice to this world. Thank you so very much.
I can't help but say this.